Hello and welcome to the fourth and final dialogue in our series around men's mental health that we've been doing through this month of June, which is Men's Mental Health Awareness Month. Save the best for last, I suspect so, but you be the judge of that. What we have tried to do is focus on some very critical, fundamental, but distinct areas and facets of men's mental health itself, so that each dialogue kind of reflects on a very important but a very different a side of circumstances that tends to impact men and men's mental health. And that is precisely what we are hoping to do today. Joining me is Aditi Mitra. I didn't think I would meet somebody who would whose titles would encapsulate all three: psychologist, counselor, and therapist. But I was proven wrong because she's a psychologist, a counselor, and an expressive arts therapist. But joking aside, somebody whom we regularly reach out to and nag, and she's very, very generous with her time and always kind of supports us and indulges us. And to have that from somebody of her caliber and experience is something that we're really, really grateful for. We want to kind of conclude this series on what is possibly, in terms of manifestation and consequence of sort of bad patterns within men, has the most extreme and harmful manifestations, which is the propensity of violence. And so that's what we will be talking about. Aditi, very warm welcome and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Karthik, for inviting me over. I love coming to your forum and thank you for that lovely introduction.
Um, this is, possibly one of those very, very vast and open-ended questions, but at what point and how does this germ of violence get seeded in a man stroke, presumably boy, child?
I would say that it starts pretty young. Um, I think, if I was to just keep the gender aside in this discourse for a little bit, I would say that mental health in general, whether if you were to just look at the two sexes, men and women, uh, we are all products of our experiences and starts from the childhood itself. Now, of course, I interact a lot with children also, and they come from very violent households where the discipline that the parents think they need to make their child undergo is very similar to possibly what they went through and maybe worse off when they were being disciplined by their parents. So that generation did not know any better, neither does this one. And I feel that this kind of violence that you're talking about is also very generational in nature. Just because the grandparents did not know how to, discipline the parents, now the parents don't know how to discipline the children. And if this continues, then it is going to just go on to, future generations as well. So I would say yes, that it starts very young because, human beings are a repository of experiences. And a lot of it, of course, comes from how and what kind of environment they are getting brought up in, and the amount of emotional freedom they have to express themselves, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. A lot of time parents would even tell their children that ro mat, like, again, I'll come to very stereotypical thinking that you're a boy, you should be brave, you should be
Sure.
strong, those kind of things. And that just sets the tone for what and how a person is allowed in terms of their emotional expression.
So I'm going to quickly take the liberty of jumping in here and just kind of divide this because these are all now, to me, just separate kind of factors within the same environment and milieu that have that assert their pressures and influence. One, of course, is the way parents tend to discipline children. And just to put things in perspective, presumably you're talking about the physical disciplining, the slapping, and all of that, just to be clear.
Not necessarily. Um,
Okay.
it is, I mean, I would also get the angle here of how violence does not always have to be very external. How something is communicated to children, for example, is also, I think it's a lot of verbal violence. Like, for example, being body shamed,
Sure.
where parents are telling their children, oh, you're growing too fat, or the fact that tumse to kuch ho nahi paega, you're such a failure, like things like that,
Yeah.
comparisons or whatever. So I feel that this kind of I would say, whether it's an external way of expressing one's frustration, or it is more of a verbal way of doing it, I think either which way it has a huge psychological impact on children.
Uh,
Hitting, yes, in,
hmm.
I mean, in that sense, and emotionally also, children, you would find, especially it hits, children are emotionally sensitive in nature, and this generation particularly that we are dealing with is highly sensitive to anything that is being told to them.
I take your point, and that makes perfect sense, which is precisely the detail I was seeking. Uh, I'll come to the specific aspect of men's expression of emotion, which I have personally come to believe is very, very limited and myopic, because across the board, what one sees is that no matter what emotion is being experienced, in terms of its expression and externalization, it tends to come out as anger, because there's very little development or evolution that has probably happened within that person in terms of their emotional vocabulary. But what I also want to ask you specifically is that, what about something, and I know these are very obvious things, but what about something like the way the father is treating the mother? Because, everything is observed and digested.
Absolutely. I think that uh, the environment in which, let's say, if you're still talking about children, the environment in which a child is being brought up also sets the tone of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So if they see that the father tends to take out his frustration either verbally or by hitting, his wife, children also somewhere start to think that maybe that is the correct way of doing it, because we are talking about primary caregivers also being role models. So the observation and the inculcation of that very observation is because you don't think your parents could be wrong. The concept of right and wrong in children does not come automatically. It is again something that they develop over a period of time. So that again then transforms into how they are taking out their anger and frustration, let's say in school. They think that hitting another child is the way to go about it, which of course, as professionals we understand that since the child is not feeling safe at home, the child feels that by lashing out at other people I'm going to feel better, and if that is not curbed or not addressed at the right time, that is what starts becoming a more potent part of their personality, because nobody is stopping, maybe nobody is stopping in the house, or nobody even feels that's a wrong thing to do because you're doing it yourself as parents, and
Yeah.
you're accepting it as as parents too. And then you will think that if it's happening in school, bacha hai, ye to hota hi hai, how does it matter, that kind of a thing. So yes, I would say that what the surroundings, the kind of surroundings they are absorbing, they are also inculcating that as if that is the right way of expressing yourself, and that is going to pan out in relationships again later on in in future.
You've made, obviously, amongst all the significant points you've made, I have a counter question to one specific point, which is you use that very relevant and important term, potency. There is this perception amongst us, a lot of kind of lay people, that when we encounter people like rapists or serial sexual offenders, that we kind of assume that इसके चाइल्डहुड में तो कोई और भी ज्यादा एक्सट्रीम इवेंट्स हुए होंगे. व्हाट डू यू मेक ऑफ दैट? आई मीन, is that kind of accurate to some extent, or as you said, if certain behavioral patterns that are starting off with, I don't want to belittle it, but let's say mild bullying remain unchecked, that itself can snowball into those patterns then.
See, one of the things we also have to take into consideration is that, you know, is there any kind of a psychiatric issue involved here as well that is going unnoticed?
Hmm.
It's not necessarily that everything is coming from a traumatic upbringing.
Right.
But there is a huge possibility that there has been a psychological disorder which has gone completely unnoticed, a personality issue that has gone completely unnoticed.
Hmm.
So, somewhere I think it's a little bit of a gray area
Hmm.
where we can't really say anything for sure. It
Hmm.
could be a combination as well of everything. But definitely, we cannot take away the fact of mental illnesses from here. We cannot take away the fact of substance abuse from here. We cannot take away the fact of trauma from here. Sometimes it's a combination of all the three things,
Sure.
which ends up, creating a bigger havoc in a person's life emotionally to be ultimately taking out and expressing their feelings and emotions in a manner which is very, horrific in that sense. So, I mean, that's, I guess, what my viewpoint to that question would be.
We it's very easy in these kinds of situations, themes, topics, and discussions to just kind of point out all the bad and the ghastly and the ugly. It gives me an opportunity to quickly say and share that we do that only in service of creating awareness. Having said that, a very important element of why we have these dialogues is to kind of approach this with first that basic awareness, and second, the second layer being anything preventive, etc. So let's talk a little bit about early signs, red flags, that can be sort of, that one should be vigilant of.
So I think early signs, I mean, one can see if a person is getting extremely withdrawn, like in the sense that, they're going through something, or if a person knows that they're going through something, but there is no dialogue happening about it. So there's withdrawal from any kind of an interaction that's happening. Let's say somebody is now getting dependent on a substance in order to sort of take care of themselves. Maybe they were drinking or smoking earlier, but now it has increased manifolds in the last, let's say, couple of weeks to months. um, any kind of behavioral change, and a sudden behavioral change in terms of how they're reacting to situations, or how they are responding to situations and things like that. I mean, these are a few things that I can clearly think off my head as warning signs that people can lose an appetite, loss in pleasurable activities. Your sleeping and your eating patterns have gone completely, haywire. These are some basic signs that can at least tell us that whatever was happening in a much more regulated manner at some one point of time, now there has been a diversion from there, and that in itself can be the starting point from where one can actually focus on if something is not going okay. And this is something that people around the individual would be able to notice far more than the person themselves.
Of course,
So,
there's obviously a loss of objectivity or awareness in the individual themselves. You know, optimistic as I want to try and be, a very grim scenario occurs to me that so many times there will be children who are, let's say, this is a child who's bullying at school, and there are imminent chances that the parent stroke father is that way himself. And so, even if the school took the typical action of let's call in the parents and tell them about this, it is entirely possible that it will be completely dismissed or not understood. What does that even mean? Does that mean that family or that child has a hope in hell? Does it mean that, let's hope that they go to a responsible enough institution where somebody does something about it?
of course, the first line of working on this is to call in the parents to see. And you're right, because sometimes I think that's where it becomes difficult because the person who may be responsible for it, and usually you get to know about it from the spouse. Sometimes it can also be the other way around, even men can be very understanding of their child's issues, but the
Sure.
wife is very thing.
Absolutely.
So over here, of course, the school does take that responsibility of trying to work things out, and then of course it's about finding ways to get the family to be a little bit more aware of the situation and take help accordingly. So we can only give them options on what they can possibly do and how they can go about it. Maybe get them to a point where we can connect them to certain people, or give them certain options. But as a school, unfortunately, there is one works within a certain boundary. One cannot go out of their way apart from what as an institution they're allowed to, how
Yeah.
they're allowed to intervene. But I think the effort is usually to actually nip it in the bud the moment the school addresses the issue by calling, even if it means you have to call them multiple times, to
Mm,
talk
mm.
about it. Even if it means that you put a mandate from the higher authorities that the father has to be present for the meeting. That's how, in fact, one has managed to actually solve a lot of these issues, because we've got the higher management involved in it as well. Because
Mm,
maybe they will not listen to a teacher, but maybe
mm,
they will
mm.
listen to the higher authority,
Correct.
right? And roping in the management to sort of help out in this issue, and if they understand the reasons behind why they need to be involved, a lot of times that has actually really really worked, because
Yeah,
there's a
that's
certain sense of, I think, I don't know if fear is the right word, but yes, a certain sense of an understanding that now everybody knows about it. Sometimes that in itself can be a bit of a
right.
detriment.
And I think that there comes a point where most parents would be ultimately quite bothered at the prospect of the child being, asked to leave the school. So ultimately, I suppose they wake up at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, it's not easy for any family to openly talk about it to people they don't really know. But of course, you have to take them into confidence, because the idea is to actually help the child. And because I think every child has potential, it just gets wasted if, something is not done. So definitely a lot of effort goes behind trying, the school trying to actually get the parents to understand the scenario and to bring about the required changes in the house, so that the child can grow up in a much better environment than what he or she is getting on a day-to-day basis.
Um, Changing tracks quite dramatically, toxic masculinity is something that has been showcased, celebrated, and romanticized even in popular culture. Huge, huge hue and cry about films such as Kabir Singh, etc. Uh, do you really feel that that some kind of responsibility, social, societal responsibility, does rest on an artist, or is it just entirely up to the wisdom of the consumer of that pop culture?
The fact that if a film is made on toxic masculinity, the question is that what is the film also trying to showcase through a narrative like that? Like, of course it's all romanticized and everything, but what is it that the artists are also trying to achieve through that? That would be my first question.
Hmm.
um, Secondly, yes, I do feel that there is a certain responsibility that any forum which has reached to a larger audience needs to be a little more responsible in terms of what they're putting forth. Because see, I think now even if you say it's 18 plus, it's no longer 18 plus. Children are watching Netflix,
Yeah, yeah.
and they have access to all content which is not for their age, but they're watching it, and most importantly, they are imbibing it. The concept of sigma male that is there, which is so prevalent in this generation, is about toxic masculinity. It is about celebrating the fact that I am a man, you are a woman, and whatever I tell you, you're supposed to do it, and they wear it like a chip on their shoulder,
Hmm.
that kind of a thing. So unfortunately this generation somewhere, and of course we have other people like Andrew Tate and stuff, people like that, who have also sort of there is an audience for something like
Of
this.
course, of course.
And the worst part is the audience is not just adults, it is children
Mm.
who are idealizing something like this as if, oh, this is how it should be, we need to go back to the way things were, and things like that.
Yeah.
So you hear this dialogue and this narrative happening, I think, along with obviously what they're also seeing in their surroundings, right? If patriarchy is something that is celebrated everywhere, then they are going to think that there's nothing wrong with it. So
Mm.
in a way, yes, I would say that any forum, again, which has an outreach to a larger audience, needs to be a little more careful, if possible. I mean, again, an artistic expression or something cannot be stopped, but definitely, yes, the discretion has to be used as well. And I think that onus, especially when it comes to children, the onus lies with the parents.
Mm.
They need to know the kind of content their children are actually consuming. Unfortunately, I feel that most of them have zero idea,
Yeah.
and they are watching, binge watching, and and they're also celebrating things like that. It's okay if there is gore and there is blood and things spilling out. I
Mm.
feel that there is a certain kind of apathy which has developed over a period of time, as if, okay, this is what it is. And I think this is where it's important.
Unfortunately, it seems to be this deadly combination of apathy and, in a lot of cases, pardon me for saying this, but just a very, very immature, rudimentary, primal understanding of censorship itself. Ki, oh, but like, इसमें sex तो है नहीं, तो क्या दिक्कत है? देखने दो, because none of the rest of it matters.
And they forget that there is also a particular kind of language which is being used. A lot of times parents would come back and say, my child does not abuse. I don't know where this child is learning all of this from, because at home the child is not saying these words. And then it's kind of funny, because obviously the child is not going to be using abusive words at home, because they still have the fear of parental authority. In school, when you are dealing with your own age group children, there is absolutely no filter, and most important, no parental supervision. So the point is that it's the language, it's the content in terms of actions, everything built together, I think, adds on to a lot of that anger and aggression. The whole idea of how gaming, those kind of playing the
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
games which
yeah,
are very violent,
absolutely.
has led people to become more aggressive in nature, to the point that you don't let them play and they're going to start breaking things. One of the biggest complaints of parents being that my child has become aggressive, but they don't seem to understand the reason behind it. So of course the work then becomes a much part of a much larger process. But yes, I mean, there has to be a certain kind of again, like I'm saying, supervision as well as responsibility from all stakeholders. you know
My only point being that so many of the stakeholders, I really feel, need orientation, sensitization, and education to begin with themselves. Many years ago, my wife and I were in a very well-known bookstore in Bombay, the most cosmopolitan city in our country, and in the children's animated film section. Of course, there were films in a bookstore because there are hardly any books in bookstores. The series, the American series Family Guy, was there, and we were completely horrified because it is so blatantly and nonchalantly adult. And then when we kind of took it to the first, level of the people who were just around, the salespeople, they very casually said, "But cartoon to hai." So, I mean, there really ought to be, I suppose, some sensitization and orientation. Well, just to bring this back full circle and kind of sum it up, um, what are some ways in which, particularly in boys, we can begin to expose them to or inculcate a more nuanced understanding of the an emotional spectrum?
I think like, I'll just give you a bit of a sense also, about why it's important to kind of encourage boys to express themselves. Is that, see, a lot of the male clients that I have got for therapy, and they've come to me, are people who are either, the adults, of course, but in either, 25 onwards till about in their mid 50s. And they reached a point where they felt that they needed to seek therapy, but nobody knows about it. Nobody in their family is aware that they're seeking therapy, because again, they still have to appear to be the man of the house, because
Yeah.
they cannot share it even with their partners about it. I think it's important that we have to start telling children, especially boys, that it's
Mm.
okay to feel what you're feeling. It's very important that we should talk about emotions. We should not give them the don'ts. We have to give them the do's as well. I think it's mostly about don'ts, that don't do this, don't do that,
Yeah.
don't cry in public, or
Yeah.
da 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 da. The expectation, because somewhere I think again, people are so ingrained with that kind of a conditioning, that even if they don't want to do it, through their words and their communication, they're doing exactly that. So I think it's very important that, at least within the families, if I can start talking about that,
Mm.
they need to be a little more open to, let's say, letting a boy cry if they feel like it, asking more questions about how they're feeling. If they, if let's say somebody, they lost a match, and they come back feeling very very upset about it and they're crying, and, not to dismiss what they're feeling. I think men's emotions are dismissed way too quickly, as well. So I think that attitude of dismissing has to not happen. You have to at least listen and then reason it out with them if there is any requirement for it. But most importantly, let them feel, let them express the way they want to. I think somewhere parents and teachers also, I would say, need to hold back their
Prejudices.
their prejudices, their biases, which comes so quickly,
Hmm.
when it comes to
Yeah, so you immediately, I mean, with before the person's had an opportunity to even express, you've shut it down, you've invalidated, and you've labeled it being this is the wrongest thing you can do, and then that's what is understood.
and I mean it is so automatic, if I can say, it, because it is, this conditioning again is such a generational thing, that to break it, people would actually have to consciously work towards doing that. Because I do see that, I sometimes feel that parents should just sit down and understand where do they need to really invest their energies into, whether the child has to be perfect at everything, or whether the child needs to be an emotionally healthy individual. Because
Absolutely.
at the end of the day, the child's success is not devoid of a child's emotional and psychological well-being. So somewhere I think parents have to, because it's always a race for things,
Mhm.
being the best at everything. My child is doing this, and like they'll post it everywhere, which is such a toxic parent group,
Absolutely.
discussion that happens. I think that's exactly where parents need to take a step back and understand what is it that I as a parent need to do for my child, so that my child becomes a more emotionally, and psychologically healthy individual, enough to take on challenges on their own, even if, there's no help around. And I think that is what the focus has to be, not so much about how well they are scoring or how many activities they're a part of and posting that on Instagram. I think parents should also just take it a little easy.
I was listening to this really, really intelligent gentleman's talk the other day. He's been a career teacher, I think, in England, if I remember correctly. And he said that there was a time when tests and examinations were a diagnostic tool. And now they've become the end goal, which is why that whole shift has happened. And I found that such a wonderful kind of and simple analysis. But apart from this critical environment of liberty and expression that ought to be created. Additionally, would it also not, there's always been this thing from generations in our country at least, our fathers, our grandfathers, for the most part, came across as these very stoic, robotic kind of individuals from home to maintain a safe distance, etc. That even at home, along with the environment, the modeling that's done is, it might help for the child to actually see the father vulnerable.
Absolutely. And I think that is Vulnerability is something that, I mean, men in particular are so uncomfortable showing because they don't feel safe doing that. I think with men, it's a huge safety issue. That first of all, I think they don't know if they would be understood if they are being vulnerable. If they would, if people would appreciate it, because they are actually moving away from a specific kind of a facade to something which is not even encouraged in
Yeah.
general. So they are also going by what is right and what is wrong, what
Sure.
is acceptable, what is not. You would find a lot of times people would say that, I want to cry, but I can't. you know it's not that they can't cry, it's just that they are finding it very difficult to do
Yeah.
it, because that would mean they have to let go of so much of their conditioning just to be able to have that moment. They will not do it in front of someone, but they'll definitely do it maybe in private somewhere. But I think yes, it's important for people, for children to see that parents can be vulnerable, because a lot of times when I'm talking to parents and I'm looking at bridging the emotional gap between parents and children, I always tell them that why don't you share stories where you were vulnerable?
Hmm.
Why don't you talk about the time when you felt sad about something?
Yeah.
And if you do that, then they will know that, oh, it has happened to you as well. And you tell them how you handled it,
Yeah.
but at least let them know that you share your feelings. Tell them that what hurt you. Simple thing that parents would come cry and crib and feel bad about the way the child behaves. So my first question to them would be that, so did you tell your child how you felt? And a lot of times they would be like, wo thodi na samjhenge. And I would then tell them that it's not important for you to understand whether they'll get it or not. It's not
Hmm.
that important.
Yeah.
The point is that you're expressing yourself, so they will have had no other choice but to at least listen to you. Whether they get it or not is a separate thing. So parents, I mean, the vulnerability aspect of it, like they will keep it inside themselves, but they will not express it. So yes, I try to train and coach parents to do that a lot. That एक थोड़ा सा करके देखो, like take something that you felt bad about.
Hmm.
You start with something very basic.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
don't have to talk about very
Correct.
emotional
You.
things.
Yeah. Yeah.
At least, okay, you initiate yourself into that kind of a dialogue. You try to initiate yourself into that kind of a discussion and see how you also feel about it. Because if parents are not experimenting with it, they will also not know to what extent they are actually okay to be vulnerable and up to what extent they are not. So
Yeah, and
that's
I mean, then, in my understanding, what happens is that in the absence of that modeling, that is, just then passing on that generational baton of those, skewed definitions that, vulnerability equal to weakness and all of that same stuff that just carries on and on.
absolutely. I mean, I think it's important for children, for example, to see that parents are also human. Like sometimes when I'm also talking separately to children and they are just going on, saying all negative things about their parents and telling me how parents should be parenting, that unko parenting nahi aati. So then I have to sort of go back and make them understand that parents must have had it hard as well.
Yeah.
So maybe you should give them that little bit of leeway in terms of understanding that maybe they've had it very difficult. So it's like you have to make them understand that parents can also be vulnerable, which they are not showing. So sometimes when you just show that perspective, even if parents are not doing it, as a professional, if I'm able to sort of give that perspective for them to just think about, I'm not even asking them to accept it, but if they're able to do it, then that just kind of switches the aspect that, oh yeah, my parents are humans, they might have felt bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think it works both ways, and it can actually very beautifully transform into something amazing, because in fact, I keep doing that with a lot of parents, especially those who've lost their spouse, and they're grieving in
Mm.
absolute, I would
Mm.
say, uh, isolation, but they are
Mm.
not involving their child into it.
Mm. Mm.
And they both are grieving, but then they're not communicating with each other, they're not being vulnerable in with each other, because they both think they need to be strong. And that adds on to so much of unnecessary bickering, because then the parent would say तुम्हें ये करना चाहिए, and the child would say आपको ये करना चाहिए, but there
Yeah.
is no communication between the two. So I think the something as I won't say it's basic, but then if I was to just put it down to a basic emotion, that grief is something that people in the family are experiencing together. And it is so important to engage everyone into it who are, uh, a part of this entire
Yeah,
experience
yeah, yeah,
themselves,
yeah.
to know that yes, everybody, it's okay to feel what you're feeling. Vulnerability is also, helping the other person know, like if I'm feeling this, and it's okay for you to feel that way. I think more than half the problem gets solved if we are just able to just do this much.
Absolutely. I mean, in any case, in that kind of specific situation, you are. I mean, it's tragedy, of course. Recognizes that, but that has provided you the most compelling common platform, right, to come together and support one another. So why wouldn't you kind of do that? Well, this is endless, but I've also found myself, and earlier I thought it was out of desperation and I was grasping at straws. But I realized that I've been concluding each of our dialogues during this series with a lot of hope, because I do see, however small it is in terms of percentage and however restricted it may be to a certain section of society at present, that there is an evolution that's happening. There is a understanding that, let's say, younger parents or younger generations of parents are developing. I never used to have the number of men that are in my office bringing their children in for class or for counseling than it is now with the younger lot. And I see, for example, an openness vis-a-vis a child being on a certain spectrum, and a sort of desire to diagnose that and take certain steps, as opposed to being in denial and saying wo to chanchal hai. So that shift is taking place, and I think it can only get better.
Absolutely. And I think, working with those kind of parents is such a pleasure, because, I think there is awareness, they understand, and they want to invest wholeheartedly in their children. So they want to give them the best thing possible, best opportunities
And then
possible.
you as a professional can focus on what you're meant to focus on, no, and not fight other fights additionally.
Absolutely, because we end up seeing both sides. I mean, as much as, of course, that's why I'm saying it's a pleasure when parents walk in and say, we are okay to get our child diagnosed. You
Yeah,
just tell us what we need to do. And then, of course, on the other hand, we still have parents who are in absolute denial, and it's just taking away so much of the child's precious time, that by the
absolutely.
time they grow up, the issue is only going to keep getting aggravated as the child keeps going into different phase of his or her life. So, I mean, I think as specialists, we can only try our best. I think a lot of times, the denial also come, or the inability to accept also comes because, if they, as parents, they want to do it, but maybe the older generation
Yeah,
is
yeah,
not okay with it.
absolutely.
So we see that, because then a lot of times, grandparents will come and start questioning and challenging, what is your
Sure.
assessment? How can you say something like that?
I've experienced this firsthand, not specifically vis-a-vis a mental health issue, but our daughter attends an alternative school here. And so many parents have come to us in all sincerity and said we were dead set on sending our child to this school as well, but the in-laws said no, or the dada dadi said no, and they were like, "Kya pagal ho gaye ho, hippie banaoge, ye karoge, wo karoge." So, there is that thing to contend with, just because we the a family unit and society is constructed the way it is.
Absolutely. And I just hope that, you know, uh, parents are going to be open to listening, because anything that is ever going to be said is for the benefit of the child. And I think schools, especially, is such a beautiful platform, because the kind of things that parents are not able to see at home because of XYZ reasons, their own schedules, the child's schedules, and the mundane things, that routine things that one
Yeah,
has to
yeah.
finish. What we are able to see in schools, we can really give a more comprehensive understanding of their child.
Hmm.
And of course, I mean, parents also feel that the child is getting labeled, like you say कि,
Yeah,
chanchal hai, या फिर ADHD being one of the most
yeah.
the term is just used like that. So is
Absolutely,
depression, so is
absolutely.
anxiety. So somewhere, yes, I mean, it would be very nice if whether the parents accept it or not, but ek baar sun lo, we'll just
Mm,
listen to
mm,
what
mm.
people have to say, because some, and it works positively also. The child doesn't speak at home but does amazingly well in school,
Correct.
and that also leads to parents being so pleasantly surprised. So yes, it will be very nice if feedback can be taken positively, and well, if one wants to work on it or not is totally a personal choice.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, let's uh, put a pause on this. It's been wonderful, as always, talking to you, so insightful, and lots and lots of takeaways. So, thank you very much for your time, for the work that you do, and let us hope and pray and wish that men can evolve a little bit. I know that we can really use it.
Thank you so much, Karthik. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
very much.